Welcome to Critical Role Demystified. I'm Mike Christensen, and this is the series where I break down the lessons we can learn, as GMs and as players, from episodes of Critical Role. Today we're tackling episode 48, Into the Frostweald. For this game, Ashley is joining via Skype. As the game opens and the party floats near the city of Kymel, they see there is also a small tent city, a refugee camp in the middle of the grasslands that has come together in the aftermath of the fall of Westron. The twins sneak forward and approach just to get a lay of the land, and they see a woman and her child. This is Elowyn and Simon, who is the first child the party ever went to rescue in Westron. They also see Dresvina, the elf they did some work for in the pre-stream games, and he's hanging out with an older man who is still dressed in noble garb, as if that matters right now. More on them later. But seeing these familiar faces seems to reassure the twins, so Vox Machina enters the refugee town. The guards are wary at first, but one of them does recognize the party from back in the day. I suspect this was how Matt planned for them to gain access into the city. I don't think his goal was to shut them out indefinitely. But the party asks the guards to go get Elowyn, since she won't just recognize them, but will testify to their good deeds. And sure enough, she vouches for them. And then we just get a really lovely moment where the party gets to see how Simon is doing, and Vax shares that his snake belt is named Simon, named after this child, and it's really sweet. Now here's a lesson that we can discuss. There is no plot reason for Elowyn to be here. Dresvina and the old man, they have a plot significance. They were being foreshadowed for later. But Elowyn and Simon are here for an emotional impact. Their purpose is to remind the players of their previous victories. Now, like I said, Elowyn helps vouch for them at their request, but I think Matt was prepared to give them access to the city anyway. In fact, the guards are mostly worried about Grog, since he looks an awful lot like those folks who displaced all of these refugees from Westron. But again, while they figured out how to use Elowyn to get into the tent city, that was not why Matt drew their attention to her. No, she's just here to make the heroes feel good about their previous heroic acts. And that's extremely valuable considering just how many hard days Vox Machina has been experiencing. They got run out of Amon, Vex died, Vax is in a weird contract with the enigmatic goddess of death, they found out Westron is occupied and overrun. They've had a lot of losses or Pyrrhic victories lately. So not only does it logically make sense that they'd run into some familiar faces here, but also, it helps the party feel like heroes who have had an impact on the world, something they haven't felt for a while now. And that feeling, in turn, might help inspire them to act more heroic going forward. Elowyn tells them that these are the refugees who were turned away from Kymel when the city just ran out of room for all the new people from Westron. There are about 60 survivors living in the camp in total. She introduces the party to Cornelius, a former bookbinder who is now the de facto leader of these refugees. Grog asks if Pike's great-grandfather Wilhand is among the survivors, but Cornelius has not seen him. No. Vox Machina offers to relocate these refugees to Whitestone, but right now Cornelius is in the middle of a situation. Orcs have been raiding the camp and have abducted almost a dozen people. Some other refugees are on a scouting mission to find the orcs and recover their people, and Cornelius does not want to leave until everybody is safely back together. Their scouts follow the orcs into the Frostweald, the same forest Vox Machina needs to go into. On a personal note, Cornelius' brother Cyrus was among the people taken by the orcs. A side note here. Cornelius has a thick southern accent and a lazy man brother who he loves but who is in trouble and needs to be saved. I feel like Cornelius is at least partially inspired by Joel from The Last of Us. It's not one for one, so I'm not totally sure, but I get that vibe. The party hangs out for the night, so that way, in the morning, Keyleth can send at least some of the refugees, the sick and elderly and the families, to Whitestone via the transport via plant spell. The party laments that Pike isn't here, and Matt reminds them that they did leave the Gatestone in Whitestone. So Percy could send a letter through with these survivors through the tree and have them send Pike back via the Gatestone as soon as they arrive. In the morning, since they are in the middle of a grassland and there are no obvious trees nearby, Vex scouts around and finds some trees not too far away. And on the way, as the people in town watch her fly and they point and smile and cheer, she does a "look ma, no hands" moment. And then Matt has her roll a dex check, she rolls a 1 and she falls off the broom and eats shit, though she plays it off well for the crowd. The broom is not quite yet ready to be used in the way Vex hopes to, at least not until Percy is able to build that seat they discussed. Anyway, they bring a small group of refugees to the tree and send them through the tree to Whitestone. And then as they finish, Dresvina and the old noble catch up with them. This old man is Dresvina's mysterious employer, who finally introduces himself, after several years of missions, as Master Qual. He's a researcher and experimenter, and he wants to hire the party to recover something from his basement in Westron, an iron circlet that was the subject of another experiment that he'd like to continue. At this point, Pike appears through the Gatestone. We're about an hour into the game, and this is the first time Ashley has actually been able to play. Now, this is very much Matt's style, but it's much less mine. So let's talk about it. The reason he waited as long as he did was because basically he didn't just want Pike to conveniently appear at this moment in the story, because the story and the realism of the world is really important to this group. And I personally would strongly recommend you not wait this long before a player can join the table. This game session only winds up going for 3.5 hours with a 15-minute break, so Ashley was not able to participate for almost a third of the session, for really no reason. I know I'm Monday morning quarterbacking an almost 8-year-old D&D game, so I've got the benefit of hindsight, but there were ways to bring her in a lot earlier. For example, she could have astrally projected for the first hour until they sent through the refugees and wrote the letter and asked her to come through the gatestone. If the party wondered why she appeared astrally all of a sudden now, what prompted her to project to them, you could use those prophetic dreams that Matt has previously established with Pike a couple of times. Well, he used them once in the Underdark, and then he tried to credit the Whitestone astral projections to a letter from Allura, but the party basically ignored that and assumed she just felt a disturbance in the Force. So yeah, you could lean into that. Maybe because the party is hanging out with so many familiar faces from Pike's hometown of Westron, Pike could just get some sort of harmonic resonance that she feels like she should be with them. Or maybe because Scanlan just told Grog at the end of the last episode that he would need to talk to Pike about Craven Edge, she just felt she was needed. Or take her feelings out of it entirely. Maybe Gilmore was finally feeling better. After all, the reason she stayed behind was ostensibly to help him heal. So now that she's not needed, she scries on the party to see where they're going, and then Gilmore teleports her to Kymel, and she can meet up with them in the refugee camp. Again, like I said, it's been 8 years, and they have not had to justify Ashley Skyping in nearly as many times by this point in the campaign, so I can also learn from their future experiences with trying to abruptly incorporate Ashley into the game. But the point is, there are ways to get your own players into the game much, much faster. But as Critical Role continues, we're going to see Matt put less and less emphasis on changing how he plans to introduce a player character to the table. Instead, he'll stick to his guns, and whenever the party happens to be in the situation that Matt planned for, that's when the player character will arrive. It's one of the major things I don't see eye to eye with him about, and while you can argue that he does this because it's a show, that's only part of the issue. For him and the players, they want the world of the game to feel as real and believable as possible. And so that means reducing contrivances, even though the consequence of that is potentially making other players sit back and watch for a long time until it's finally their chance to join the game and play. And there are some times when Matt will hold off on introducing someone, and I actually think it works, because it better serves the story and the character arcs. Or sometimes the reveal is just really fun, like when Ashley herself surprised the party in person in episode 22. But that's the core issue here, isn't it? Fun. And in general, I strongly encourage you to focus more on the fun of your players, and usually I think that means challenging yourself to come up with some reasons why a player would be able to join the party earlier in the session, especially when the party is this high level, and they do have so many high level allies. I don't think it should be that difficult to figure out a faster way to introduce characters, rather than having a player sit on the sidelines until the party happens to correctly guess where they need to go and what they need to do, so this other player can finally start playing the game. Anyway, now that they are all together, the party tries to get a little bit more information out of Qual, but he's still very cagey about what this circlet does. He also only promises them a reward from his collection, nothing specific. But they do wonder if he knows something about the vestiges of divergence. Well, Scanlan and Keyleth ask about the vestiges. Grog and Vex are very reluctant to tell somebody who clearly collects magic items that they are looking for some awesome magic items. That being said, Master Qual is able to give them a small contraption that's basically a low-range magic item compass. But it's just a loner. He wants it back. The party nicknames it the Hunk of Qual, and if I remember correctly, they're going to use it a few times in the next few episodes, but this is the mildest of spoilers. I don't think he ever gets it back. Grog takes Pike aside and tells her what's going on in Westron. She agrees that they should wait until they're ready before charging into Westron and dealing with Kevdak. He also gives her his Gauntlets of Ogre Power, since he can't use them anymore, and so now her strength is higher than his. Because Keyleth sent folks through the tree, they can't wind walk to the Frostweald, so they have to walk there. And they realize, wow, it's been a minute since we just walked anywhere. In fact, I did the math here. Besides the last leg of the journey into Whitestone in the Briarwood arc, this is the first time on stream that we've watched the party just walk to a new adventure location. I'm including the Underdark as one vast adventure location since it was basically a mega dungeon. They walked to Craghammer before the live stream started, but then they teleported out of the Underdark, took an airship to Vasselheim, rode horses out of town to face the White Dragon, teleported home to Amon, teleported to Westron and took horses most of the way to get to Whitestone, walked for like 2 days through the mountains to get to Whitestone. That's the time that I was talking about earlier. Then they tree-strode from Whitestone to Amon after the Briarwood arc, tree-strode to Whitestone after the Conclave attack, tree-strode to Vasselheim, wind-walked to the Sunken Tomb, tree-strode to Whitestone, tree-strode to Westron, wind-walked to Kymel, and now they're on foot, slumming it like they're back in the single-digit levels. And this isn't exactly a lesson, but it's useful to see just how much different adventuring feels once your party gets to higher levels and starts having access to instantaneous travel, or at least spells that make travel a hell of a lot easier. Vax is keeping his distance from Pike, and she tries to insight check him, and she rolls a natural 20. So he texts her with his insight since they can't whisper to each other. Scanlan creates a mansion for them to stay in for the night, and then Scanlan takes Pike aside and talks to her about the sword. Now this is interesting. Travis's face reads like this is a big betrayal. Like, oh my god, Scanlan broke the bro code. But in the last episode, Scanlan did say that he was going to talk to Pike. I don't know if Travis just didn't hear Sam when he said that part of his research into the sword would include talking to Pike, or if he did hear it and forgot about it over the past week. Either way, Travis doesn't do anything about this because he understands the value of dramatic irony. He, as a player, knows something that his character doesn't. That's actually true across the board for this entire Craven Edge storyline. I'm gonna do another video this year about great ways to handle secrets in your game without having a ton of metagaming, but it's what makes this storyline work so well. Everybody above the table knows that Grog has a talking sword that drinks blood and makes him swole, but hardly anybody in the group knows anything about this. Just Scanlan, now Pike, and technically Percy, but he hasn't really checked in on how Grog's doing with the sword since he actually gave it to him, except briefly during the argument in episode 40. Anyway, Pike agrees to keep an eye on Grog. Vex pulls Vax aside, and for the first time, they talk about his fears about the Raven Queen. Well, Vex talks and Vax sulks. But that 30 gold book she's got has information about the Raven Queen. And in practice, this manifests as Vex having the description of the Raven Queen from the 4th edition Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, specifically her list of commandments for her followers.
It says that those that follow her must hold no pity for those who suffer and die, for death is the natural end of life. It's not bad. Bring down the proud who try to cast off the chains of fate. As the instrument of the Raven Queen, you must punish hubris where you find it. Bring down those who try to cast off the chains of fate. The Raven Queen represents death, right? Therefore, she hates those that live an immortal life. She hates vampires. We hate vampires. They're terrible people, right? That's not bad. Watch for the cults of Orcus and stamp them out whenever they arise. Orcus is bad. If she hates him, then she must not be that terrible.
She's already speaking to me.
Oh. And?
I don't know, Vexalia. I don't know what this means. I know that she's not a force for evil. Neither are funeral homes. I don't want to bed down in one.
Well, that's understandable.
But it doesn't matter. And I'd do it again because I did it for you. And I am trying to come to terms with it, not knowing the terms.
Vex basically reassures Vax that being the champion for a god is badass, and she still loves him and it's all going to be okay. It's a lovely moment, and while it doesn't completely rewrite what Vax is feeling, it's a very necessary moment to try to help pull him out of the darkness he's lingering in. In the morning, at breakfast, they play some more target practice with the chickens, with Vex on her broom, trying to shoot arrows at them. And of course, because she's still rolling a disadvantage, she rolls a 1. Matt has Scanlan roll a saving throw, and he rolls only a 9. So Matt has Vex roll damage on Scanlan, and she rolls full damage. That's 17 damage. Now, I've been looking forward to talking about this scene ever since I started this series, because here's what happens next.
So, Scanlan, as you're watching this chewing, suddenly...
Shit! Scanlan, I'm so sorry! I landed, I instantly, cast Cure Wounds on him. I'm sorry.
The old chicken just dangling at the end of the arrow.
Pike, help.
I'm just applauding.
Blood everywhere.
Just applauding. Again.
Just one of the funniest screams I've ever heard. But I also think there's a really funny lesson here. Watch Matt as he describes this. He describes Scanlan seeing the arrow coming his way, and then he does the sound effect, and then he starts describing something, but Scanlan screams. Matt starts talking a second time, but Scanlan is still screaming. Then Matt goes for a third time to add something, but at this point, Sam has mimed the arrow sticking out of his neck, which probably contradicts what Matt was going to say. It seems from the way that he pantomimed the sound effect that Matt was going to describe the arrow hitting Scanlan's center mass. But clearly, Matt must have given up on trying to add any description because, you know what? Sam's screaming and pantomiming has gotten the point across extremely effectively. So he yes-ands and just adds a small detail that there's a chicken dangling at the end of the arrow. Look, Most of us don't have a Sam Riegel at our tables, but there are some times where the players pick up on what we're laying down, and they run with it. And while they might not execute exactly what we had in mind, what they do still might work perfectly well, and so it's just a lot of fun to just let them roll with it. They set out on their journey and enter the Frostweald, a forest that is always experiencing winter no matter what the weather is for the rest of Tal'Dorei. At the border of the forest, Keyleth waves the hunk of qual in the air, but it doesn't tell them anything about where to go to find any magic items. At this point, Laura IRL actually asks to go to the bathroom, but Matt says he's working on a break, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. Keyleth tries to cast Find the Path to make their route easier. It's her first time casting it, so they kind of have to figure out how it's going to work. Not how the rules work, but how it's going to interact with their situation. Now, the spell can't take them to the Sphinx's lair, since they've never seen it or been there, so Marisha is very clear that she's not trying to use the spell to show the path to the lair specifically. But she could use it to get them to the Stormcrest Mountains, and she's hoping that will help, since the Sphinx's lair is somewhere in the Stormcrest Mountains. But Matt feels like, since the mountain range is so vast, and it is visible beyond the forest they're entering, the spell wouldn't tell them anything besides go through the forest towards those mountains you can already see. But what's nice is, in this moment, he tells her that before she casts and wastes the spell. He's basically saying, as the GM, I do not know what advantage the spell would give you, and so I'm not going to be able to reward this with anything additional. I can tell you the spell won't tell you anything you don't already know, so it would be a waste of a spell. This is actually something that Megaphone Man has been discussing in his live streams as he's watching Critical Role for the very first time. Go check out his channel, and don't you dare spoil anything for him. He's a very sweet summer child. He doesn't know anything about what's coming in the campaign. But he's recently seen several examples where Matt just says, okay, you cast the spell or try to build the thing, and this is what it does. And then the player says, oh, that's not what I meant. And then they basically have to renegotiate to get on the same page. And sometimes I do think that's just part of Matt's style. The players will do something, and he'll say, okay, here's what happens. And sometimes the players say, wow, I sure misunderstood what was going to happen. And honestly, that's inevitable in D&D. It's gonna happen sometimes. But we're starting to get to a point where Matt is getting at least a little bit better at telegraphing those potential consequences by trying to get on the same page as the player and understand exactly what they're trying to do. And the more that you can telegraph consequences, the more fair things feel for your players. For example, and I know I'm kicking a hornet's nest, but when we discussed the broom theft in episode 46, a bunch of people very understandably said in the comments, Matt was not punishing Vex. Changing her alignment was just the consequence of her actions. But as far as we know, Laura had never seen anyone's alignment change in D&D, with the exception of Tiberius, whose alignment also changed after he murdered the old woman. And it's very likely that Laura did not understand that the theft of the broom was on the same level as murdering an unconscious enemy in cold blood when she had very clearly begun to retreat, and also when there were other mitigating circumstances around that player. The issue isn't just the change of alignment, it's also the fact that the consequences weren't appropriately telegraphed. And I do think that as Matt's style changes, I feel like he starts to become a little bit more of a hard ass. There are some moments where Matt assumes it's obvious that some course of action would have a negative consequence, so he doesn't necessarily feel the need to telegraph those consequences to the player. And on some occasions, the player had no idea how bad the consequences could be, and that potentially leads to a moment where they feel frustrated. But here we're seeing a moment that I think we can learn a lot from, where Matt seems to realize that if Marisha had understood what he assumes would be obvious to Keyleth, she probably would not have cast the spell. Or he's just trying to figure out what she's asking for that she's not making clear, because as it stands, the spell would not be useful. He essentially preemptively says, I am not trying to tell you how to play, but this spell would not get you anything that you don't already have. And when you do that as a GM, you don't only improve communication, but you also help build more trust. If he had just said, okay, you cast it and it says go forward, like it's obvious, go figure, it tells you to go to the place you already knew you had to go to, then it kind of feels like you're just trying to gotcha them. The player was clearly hoping that there would be some benefit, but if you feel that there's nothing to be gained, and the characters would clearly know that or be able to guess that, like in this case, then first, just try to clarify what they're trying to do. This will give them a chance to either make the case for what they're hoping they'll get out of it, or it will lead them to draw the conclusion that this approach isn't going to yield any benefit. I really appreciate Matt in this moment for giving his players a chance to consider whether they actually wanted to cast the spell, knowing that it may not be able to give them anything super worthwhile for casting it. However, as we will see later, Marisha thought Matt was telling her that there's no point in preparing the spell at all, so she switches it out for another spell. After all, it was still really early in the adventuring day, so she felt like it was reasonable for Keyleth to replace the spell, especially if she thought that that's what the GM was trying to tell her. And that's not what Matt meant. First of all, they were already journeying, so Matt would not want them changing their spells at this point. That's part of what makes prepared casters challenging and interesting. You prepare spells because you're rolling the dice that they might be useful. Matt very reasonably felt like once they'd left the mansion, the spells that she chose are the spells that she chose, and I happen to agree. But also, I have a hard time imagining that Matt would ever tell a player that a spell would never be useful, because I just don't think that's how he thinks about D&D. So yeah, for both those reasons, I agree with Matt from like an hour from now that Marisha should not have switched out the spell, that moment had long ago passed. But that being said, something neither Matt nor Marisha seem to realize is that Find the Path might actually be useless in the Vox Machina campaign because of how Matt runs his games. But we'll talk about that in a bit. As the party crosses through the forest, they come upon an obelisk in the snow with some obscure carvings to the goddess Ioun, the same goddess whose markings decorate the chamber where they first met Osisa, the other Sphinx. Matt also draws the connection to Scanlan's Ioun Stone, which is named after this goddess. Keyleth tries using the Hunk of Qual again, and it has no effect. In the last episode, I talked about how much I like it when the party gets vague details about a magic item and then they get a card, but here, there is no card, so they don't seem to know what it does. They're treating it like a cast detect magic, but it does not seem like that's the case. Anyway, as they look over the obelisk, there's some more writing carved in at the bottom that's obscured by the snow. But also in the snow are some pieces of statues. Keyleth uses control water to melt the snow and reveals the writing and more statues. Some are whole, others have pieces broken off or are completely shattered. But it looks like these statues depict people looking either aggressive or scared. Of course, that's a code word to anybody who knows mythology to back up and beat feet because some sort of monster or spell or curse turned these people to stone. And the portion of the party that came to the Frostweald last time actually remembers fighting some basilisks here. But this is where Matt pauses the session for a break. So this is something that's really useful to think about. Not just the most dramatic place to end a session, but also the most dramatic places to pause your sessions for breaks. I strongly believe that you should at least take one bio break during your D&D game. I made a video about that a couple of years ago, go check it out right here. But in short, you really want to try to find the most dramatic moment you can go to a break so your players are champing at the bit to get back to the table and resume the story. And if you're playing in person, then this gives the players something to talk about during the break, which really helps keep their headspace connected to the game. Now, this is not always possible. I drink a lot of water, and sometimes I need extra breaks, and those do not always come at the most ideal times. And in your home games, you might not be as strict as Critical Role is about people getting up from the table and going to the bathroom, because you're not doing a live stream. When nature calls, you may just have people go, and that's fine. But Matt clearly knew that he was pretty close to a dramatic reveal, so he asked his players to hang with him for just a few more minutes, and then about 13 minutes later, he drops a sinister detail about the statues and then calls for a break. Now, he could have just thrown the statues into the area where they first entered when they asked for a break, and just rushed to that dramatic moment. But by grouping them around the obelisk, it does two things. One, it forces them to stick around the obelisk to try to get more information, because it's clearly related to their quest, and there's writing they haven't been able to read yet. This creates a lot of tension, because in order to get this information, they have to linger in an area that they know is dangerous. And second, this tells a story. Why are there all these stone bodies around here? Well, because people probably got close to the obelisk to investigate it, and then they ran into the basilisks. And it seems like that keeps happening. People approach the obelisk and then they get turned to stone. These basilisks are like bears that hang out near a campsite because there are always going to be more people in the area with food. As the break ends, Matt recaps the writing on the obelisk, partially covered in snow, and the broken statues. That's a nice little detail, just catch them up with what was going on. They melt the snow away and investigate the writing, which is written in Elvish, and reads, "A name is earned." And beneath the writing, there's a divot shaped like a reverse pyramid. So there's something here to interact with. But by melting the snow, they reveal some 4-foot wide holes in the ground, from which some monsters burst forth. Basilisks! Specifically, these are ice-scale basilisks, which are a specific breed local to this forest. So it's initiative, and here are some highlights. Vax uses the sharpshooter feat to take a -5 to attack and +10 to damage, which I had no memory of him ever doing in this campaign, though I do suspect that it's probably not as useful when they're fighting ancient red dragons. But thanks to that, and sneak attack and haste, he kills one basilisk in a single round. It's very cool. Keyleth turns into a giant scorpion, which has Blindsight, so it doesn't need to make eye contact to attack. But Matt insists if she averted her gaze at the start of the turn to avoid getting turned to stone, then she still has disadvantage on all her strikes. But after she rolls all her attacks and misses with them all, Matt realizes he's thinking about this wrong. Averting their gaze and not getting petrified isn't also a magical effect that grants disadvantage. You get disadvantage for not seeing the target, and a giant scorpion with Blindsight can avert its gaze and still sense its surroundings. A lot of creatures with Blindsight don't even have eyes. So after she rolls and fails with those 3 attacks, he rethinks this and realizes it doesn't really make sense. The choice to avert her gaze at the start of her turn does not carry over once they change the conditions of the test. So it took a while for them to get there, but now he has her re-roll all of her attacks. Scanlan blasts a fireball into the holes the basilisks came out of, which closes some of them off and causes the ground to decompress a little bit, or depress, I guess. Keyleth uses Wall of Stone to close off the other holes and trap the remaining basilisks beneath the ground. They return to the obelisk and keep trying to figure it out as the basilisks are trying to break through the stone, but thankfully as one's head bursts forth, Grog can just cut it off and feed Cravenedge. After a while, the impacts get quiet. The basilisks either gave up and moved on, or suffocated and died. Scanlan places his Ion Stone into the small hole in the obelisk, and the top of the obelisk lights up, and a matching light appears on the mountainside. So now, as Vex points out, Keyleth can use Find the Path. Except, like I said earlier, Marisha thought Matt was saying, this spell will be useless today, you should prepare something else. So she had it swapped out. So he says, no, you wouldn't have been able to prepare different spells, so she unretcons her spells and re-prepares Find the Path and casts it on that light on the mountainside. Now, right now, it seems like Marisha is confused about how they wind up so extremely off-sync with each other, but never mind, Vex says the spell will be useful, and Matt says she can have the spell after all, so she casts the spell again. I also think that Laura is just trying to help. I mean, obviously, she probably wants an advantage in travel, but I think she also wants Marisha to feel better about this 6th level spell, so sure, let's cast it here. But this time, Matt allows Keyleth to cast the spell, and then he just kind of says, the spell tells you that the best way to travel towards the beacon is to travel toward the beacon. And I get what he's saying, like, especially because they haven't yet pulled the Ion Stone out of the obelisk and made the lights go away, so the destination is obvious right now. But this type of comment just doesn't really help the miscommunication that they're dealing with. Like, I get it, but come on, man. Marisha should not have swapped out the spell earlier, but she didn't write that spell, nor did she make it a 6th level spell. She doesn't seem to know why she keeps getting responses that kind of just boil down to Matt saying, you're doing it wrong, when she's really trying to be clear. So she kind of just keeps second-guessing herself because she doesn't understand the friction occurring at the table. At least that's my impression. The Basilisk Blindsight debate was completely unrelated to this spell, but it probably added to this feeling. And now they're having a second Find the Path debate and the third Keyleth Rules debate of the night. The entire table has drifted into this weird mood where everything just feels off and no one knows why. The cast members literally say, I think it was a weird pot of coffee. That's how weird things have gotten. But weird coffee or no, I kind of think this is just an issue with Find the Path being cast in this campaign. Look, let's break it down. I would imagine Marisha just doesn't want to misuse her 1 6th level slot of the day. That's where all this is coming from. She prepared a 6th level spell that is useful for travel, and she's trying to find the best place to use it. Matt also does not want her to use it at the wrong time because that's not fun for anyone. And once they pull the Ion Stone out of the obelisk and the lights fade, he does try to validate her choice by saying that they still have a direct path to get to that light, thanks to her casting Find the Path. That's a decent olive branch. Except I get the sense that he thought the light on the mountain would be enough, and even once they couldn't see it anymore, they could just remember where it was, so they wouldn't need a spell like this. And I suspect Marisha was expecting to see some sort of specific winding path up the mountain to show the safest route, rather than just being told, you already know where to go, just go there, the spell confirms you should go there. And miscommunications aside, I think this is the core issue they're dealing with. Matt created a puzzle that he expected them to solve. His solution was for them to use the Ion Stone to figure out where to go next, and then they would just have all the information they needed. Marisha is trying to use a high-level spell designed to allow them to bypass treacherous terrain and find the best path to their destination. But at least throughout Campaign 1, Matt tends to make those alternate pathways really clear to his party, or he'll just limit the travel so there really aren't any alternate pathways, so they don't have to worry about those choices. So with that in mind, is Find the Path a useful spell in this campaign? We as a D&D community talk a lot about the kind of spells that ruin a style of play, like how Goodberry robs the tension from a survival horror campaign. But I don't think we talk nearly as much about the spells that just have no place in other campaign styles because they're kind of useless, to the point where you just might as well never prepare them. I would never claim that there is no scenario where Find the Path could be useful, even in a highly cinematic game like Critical Role. I can't remember if this ever happened, so this is not a spoiler, but I can think of several scenarios during Campaign 2 where Find the Path could be really useful, because that campaign just has a lot more scenes of the party looking at maps and navigating the terrain. I also don't think it's a coincidence that Campaign 2 is also when Matt lands on a much better random encounter system, and so a spell like Find the Path is better suited to a campaign where you might actually get lost and face some consequences for doing so. But that's not the case here. The fact that Matt keeps saying, the spell tells you that the quickest way to that destination is to go towards that destination, does kind of speak to the fact that he doesn't really have any ideas for how to reward the use of this spell. What's also frustrating is that I have seen people point to this as another example of Marisha not reading her spells. And no, that's not the case. She knows what the spell does. As we saw from the beginning, she understands the limits of the spell, and that's why she's not trying to use it to get directly to the Sphinx's lair. But she can't quite make an argument to Matt about the benefits she's getting from the spell, other than, we're going to know how to get to that location. She knows what it does, but she and Matt can't really seem to figure out what it's for. Because I don't think it's for anything in the Vox Machina campaign. because Matt is so much less likely to allow them to get lost if they have a really clear goal in mind. I mean, even when Matt describes scrying scenes, he changes the description to show them the pathway of how they got there. Because at least right now, he's far less likely to design an adventure where the party will have to explore a region, and far more likely to design an adventure where the party will run into a few specific challenges before arriving at their destination. If you're running a game where the party is much more likely to take a wrong turn in the woods, then yeah, Find the Path could be far more useful. But Vox Machina has really high skills to stay on the path or find tracks or locate clues, and if they ever do get lost, Vex can hop on a broom and reorient them. So the spell just isn't going to serve them all that well in most situations Matt is prepared. It's no one's fault, really, it's just not the right spell for this campaign. Also, this is unrelated, but there's another issue with Find the Path. It is a concentration spell, and if they're going to get into combat, like if they fight some basilisks or some orcs, then you could lose the spell. Which also sucks, but druids also have a lot of concentration spells because it's kind of the only way to keep them balanced. It's not really the main issue, but it is one of the reasons I personally don't love Find the Path, especially in this style of game. Again, like Windwalk, this spell is perfect for really specific circumstances, but I just don't think that's the situation they're in right now. Anyway, the party looks for anything else that they might find of note before they move on, and Vax sees that one of the statues is Tyriok, the Mapmaker from Vasselheim they met back in episode 22. One of his arms is broken off at the elbow. Vax looks him over, and then moves on, without telling anyone else. The rest of the cast members protest that they could heal him. Pike has the spell to save him. But Vax still says nothing. And then after giving it some thought, he does tell Pike after all. Now, maybe everyone else changed his mind, but I also wonder if Vax wasn't trying to figure out how the situation might relate to his role as the Raven Queen's champion. After all, as Vex just said earlier, the Raven Queen does not like people who break the natural order of the world. Was Vax looking at this stone body and thinking, I don't like it, but he's dead and I have to learn to live with that now, given my divine patron? Or maybe he was just thinking, this poor man who literally makes maps for a living just lost his arm, would he even want to come back? Regardless, whatever the mental calculus he was doing, he does decide to tell Pike, and Pike casts Greater Restoration on the Mapmaker. And of course, his severed arm starts spraying blood everywhere, much to the delight of Cravenedge. They talk about reattaching his arm, and they realize they should have done that before restoring him to life. Oops. Oh well, all they can do is just keep saying, oh my god, we're terrible people, we're just the worst, which they do several times during this scene. Thankfully, Tyriok is ambidextrous. And of course, his voice is just a delight.
These escorts that you had with you who were also turned to stone, were they important to you? Were they friends of yours?
Oh no, I hired them as part of this endeavor. They were nice fellas. Hold on a second. He starts walking off and starts like rummaging through the pieces of stone and various people, kind of picking up heads. No. Well, that's Alex. Golly, I don't I don't know where Gerald is, but
They debate just sending Tyriok back to the refugee camp, but he's actually been to the base of the mountain, so he might have useful information. So they bring him along for now.
Thank you. I realize now that if you hadn't come by, I probably would have been there forever.
Yes, well, we're sorry about the arm, dear.
There are worse things. And I can retrain to write with this arm. It's totally fine.
Yes, you're lucky to be alive, and now you're going on an adventure with us? Hey, who has two thumbs and is really excited? You and me, both doing this.
They ask about orcs, and Tyriok actually knows where the orcs are, or at least where they were. Ironically, he was specifically trying to avoid them and accidentally wound up in the Basilisk territory. So he can lead them to the orc camp and then hide safely as Vox Machina takes care of the orcs. Meanwhile, Vax sneaks away from the group and kneels in the snow, and he begins talking to himself. Well, no, not to himself.
I know you can hear me. I'm going to need more than nightmares. A deal has been struck, and I will honor it. I need to understand what this is. Anytime.
In that moment, the white snow suddenly flashes to dark, and it's like you were struck blind. You gasp instinctually as your vision goes dark. Nothing. And you see come from the shadow another flash, another vision. It's of Vasselheim. Another flash. You look out and you can see there's one large, darkened structure that you have not visited but passed by on the southeastern side of Vasselheim. This
Temple. Temple of Raven Queen.
Temple of the Raven Queen.
The actual name of this, and you've heard it in passing before, and you were given your initial pass over of the
I got goosebumps.
trying to find the specific name here so I don't mess it up. But it's in here somewhere. You see this dark obsidian structure that is ridged almost like an even rib cage along each side. It is ominous, and it's stuck out in the middle of the city because amongst the rest of the jovial atmosphere, it kind of loomed over the Amaranthine Oubliette. But this was the central temple to the Raven Queen. You then flash once again in a long chamber, and you see veils, dark veils, passing by, one after another after another. Another flash forward, and you see a chamber with dark brown, smooth floors. You see gold trim along large pillars that reach up to a dome-type stained glass ceiling of amber colors and white. And in the center of this chamber, you see what appears to be a pool of still crimson liquid. You see the crimson liquid shift, and a form rises up out of it. An arm rises up and beckons a finger. Vision goes to black, and you're back in the forest.
Fuck. Not exactly what I was talking about. At some point, a little bit of clarification. Congratulations, you're creepy as fuck. We'll work it out. I head back to the group.
Now that's the end of the episode, but let's talk about that moment. Obviously, Matt had no idea Vax was going to ask for an impromptu audience with the Raven Queen, and so he has to come up with something on the fly. But more than that, Matt is in a minor dilemma. He wants the Raven Queen to be mysterious and unknowable, not just because that fits her vibe, but also because, from his view, all the gods should be a bit hard to just sit down and talk with. And it could especially cause issues if the Raven Queen starts showing up and taking conference calls when Sarenrae doesn't have anywhere near that level of approachability, despite Pike being, I think the highest level worshiper of Sarenrae's that we've ever seen. So the Raven Queen can't just drop down and say, "Here's what I want from you," in plain, frank English. Additionally, Matt's goal with the Raven Queen is not to override Vax's agency. Yes, she will ask something of him, we'll get there later, but Liam is still very much in control of what his character does. However, Vax is starting to get frustrated with the vagueness, and potentially that means Liam is frustrated with the lack of progress for the storyline. He's ready for the next beat in the story. And Matt has been steering him toward a more positive outlook on this arrangement. I talked about that in the last episode with the dream sequence that is meant to say, you still have agency. But I wonder if he didn't get there thanks in part to his conversation with Vex earlier in this episode. So Matt has to give him something. And so Matt basically does the exact same thing he does when he describes a scrying scene. He shows Vax where he needs to go and how to get there. In this case, he shows him Vasselheim, and then he shows him the Temple of the Raven Queen. Now, that temple has a name, it's the Dusk Meadow, but Matt cannot find that in his notes right now, so he moves on. He realizes that this proper noun is not the most important thing to impart to his players in this moment, when his priority should instead be on maintaining the tension of the scene. So he brings us into the temple and shows somebody emerging from a pool of blood and beckoning Vax forward. Now, I don't know whether Matt had this scene prepared in his head in case Vax ever got back to Vasselheim, or whether he made this up on the fly, but that doesn't matter. For our purposes, let's assume that he just made it up in the moment, because that will help us see how he landed on each decision based on the information he had already established. First, Vax wants more concrete information. Matt is not going to give that to him right now, but he can give him a side quest to go on in the future. So thus, the vision. But what will it show him? Well, there's one location that is the holiest place in the world. It's actually very near where Vax made the deal with the Raven Queen initially. They just didn't happen to go back there at the time. So Vax sees Vasselheim and then the Raven Queen's temple. And then we cut inside. Okay, that one is obvious. Go to the Temple of the Raven Queen really means go inside the Temple of the Raven Queen. I bumped the camera again. I promise one of these days I'll figure out how to make videos. Next, we need Vax to see something that he will have to interact with, something that represents the Raven Queen in some way. Well, if it relates to death, it could be blood. Matt likes blood magic a lot more than I do. He was already working on the Blood Hunter, and there are a couple of other blood magic subclass options in the Tal'Dorei campaign book he would go on to write within the next year or so. So I think that partially explains why he put the pool of blood there, because it lines up really well with his own sensibilities, and it represents death. And then he shows somebody rising up out of the blood. As we'll see when Vax fulfills this side quest, this is a very literal clue toward what Vax will have to do when he gets to the Temple of the Raven Queen. But we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, the party takes off towards the orcs, and that's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks to discuss episode 49, A Name is Earned. This episode has a lot that we can learn from, including some more riddles, more Craven Edge content, and of course, Keyleth casts another high-level spell for the very first time, and everything just goes perfectly right away, as always happens whenever she casts any high-level spell for the very first time. But we'll cover all of that in 2 weeks. In the meantime, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell if you want to see more of my videos. Support me on Patreon if you'd like to see me make these videos more often. I would love to make them weekly, and Patreon is how we're going to do that. Join my Discord server to hang out with other awesome people, and sign up for my newsletter to catch some updates. Follow me on Twitch to see me go live. I'll try to go live as often as I can until the birth of my child. After that, who knows? So enjoy it now. We talked a lot about Find the Path as a spell that interacts with the exploration pillar of the game, but if you want to know about a game where exploration matters a lot more than in 5e, click here to see me create some example characters for the game Shadowdark. Until next time, play fair and have fun.